The thing most people never learn about money is not that banks are powerful. Everyone knows that. It is that banks are powerful in a very specific way. They sit in the middle, they sit between your income and your purchases, between your savings and your emergencies, between your assets and your next opportunity, between your patience and your urgency, between your need for capital and your ability to put capital to work. That middle position is where the money is made. And once you truly understand that, your entire relationship with finance changes, not because you become angry. Anger by itself is useless. It changes because you begin to see something that was hidden in plain sight the whole time. The bank does not merely store your money. The bank organizes the path your money must travel. And every time your money travels through a path controlled by someone else gets paid. That is the real lesson. Not that banks are evil. Not that every loan is a trap. Not that all institutional finance should be rejected by some loud ideological gesture. The lesson is simpler and more important. Capital is most valuable when it keeps circulating inside your own system, instead of constantly escaping into someone else. That is what wealthy families understand far better than ordinary households do. They do not always talk about it directly because the truth is not flashy enough to make for a good dinner. Party monologue. It sounds too practical, too mechanical, too cold. But if you watch what they actually do rather than what the culture says they must believe, you notice a pattern. They do not like paying strangers for permission to use their own momentum. They do not like sending unnecessary interest out of the household if that same interest could be redirected inward. They do not like forcing every important decision to pass through a bank loan committee when a structure can be built that gives them more autonomy. That is the difference. Not usually intelligence. Not always courage, infrastructure, financial infrastructure. I have watched people work for 30 or 40 years, save dutifully, keep decent balances, make real progress, and still somehow remain financially dependent in a way that is hard for them to articulate. They have money, but they do not control the channels through which money moves. They still save in one place, borrow in another, insure in another, invest in another, and ask permission everywhere. Their capital exists, but it does not belong to a coherent ecosystem. It is fragmented. And fragmented capital is less powerful than organized capital even when the nominal amount is the same. That is why this subject matters so much. Because once you learn how to build even a modest private financial ecosystem, the same dollar starts doing more than one job. That is where the quiet leap happens, not through some miracle stock, not through some fantasy of passive income falling from the sky through structure. I want to be very clear before we go further. What I am talking about here is not magic. It is not a loophole in the childish sense. It is not a get-rich-quick system for people who cannot sit still long enough to let a normal plan mature. It is also not some internet grift about becoming your own bank by repeating slogans while buying products. You do not understand the phrase has been abused badly. I want to rescue the logic from the sales pitch because the logic is sound. At the highest level, becoming your own bank means building structures in which you can access capital, direct capital, borrow against capital, and recycle interest and return inside your own world as often as possible. That is the heart of it, not secrecy, not rebellion. Control. The source material in front of me lays out 3 core mechanisms for doing this. And I think the grouping is wise because each one solves a slightly different problem. The first is permanent life insurance built for cash value rather than theatrical death. Benefit marketing. The second is strategic borrowing from retirement structures that already belong to you. The third is private lending through entities you control, a system for making capital move through your own legal architecture rather than always through outside creditors. These are not equal tools. They are not right for every person. They are not all suitable at every stage of life, but they all reflect the same deeper principle. Do not ask outside finance to do work your own balance sheet could be structured to do. That is the principle. Once you hear it clearly, a lot of ordinary financial behavior starts looking strangely weak. A person can have savings and still be financially dependent. A person can have good income and still have no internal liquidity architecture. A person can be disciplined and still be surrendering the most profitable part of the money game, which is the spread between owning capital and paying to access capital banks. Live on that spread. Sophisticated families often keep more of it. That is what I want to explain. Let us start with the first tool, the one that creates the strongest emotional reaction and therefore usually gets the least honest explanation: permanent life insurance. The moment many people hear that phrase, they close up. I understand why. The industry earned that distrust. For decades, the product has been sold badly, framed lazily, and pushed into households for reasons that had more to do with commissions than with long-term design. Huge death, benefit language, vague talk about safety, complicated illustrations, soft promises, hard fees. A lot of ordinary people were sold expensive insurance before they had any real business owning it, and the product acquired the reputation that naturally follows bad distribution. Fine, that still does not mean the structure itself is useless. It means the structure has to be understood correctly. The relevant tax logic here is not mystical. It exists because U.S. tax law gives certain properly designed life insurance policies favorable treatment. If they stay within defined boundaries, if the policy is structured correctly, the internal cash value can grow without the annual tax friction you would face in a taxable account, and access can often be obtained through policy loans rather than taxable withdrawals. That distinction matters, not because jargon is impressive, because mechanics matter. Here is the adult version of the structure. You establish a permanent policy, not a short-term policy that expires and was never designed to hold meaningful internal capital in the first place. Then you fund it heavily enough that the cash value becomes the point, not the ornament that requires restraint in design. The policy must not be built to maximize the emotional excitement of the death benefit. It must be built to maximize early cash value efficiency while staying within the rules necessary to preserve the tax treatment. That is where so many people get hurt. The agent gets paid more when the design is fatter, flashier, and more insurance heavy than the client actually needs. The client needs cash value efficiency. The agent often prefers commission density. Those are not the same objective. The difference between a useful policy and an expensive disappointment is often found in that gap. I have seen many people buy policies that looked elegant in a brochure and behaved terribly in reality because too much of the early funding went to cost commission and drag instead of to liquid internal capital. If the surrender value after major early premiums is far below what any reasonable person would have expected, that is not a philosophical issue. It is a design issue. The structure was serving the seller too well and the owner too poorly. So let us imagine the policy is built correctly. Now the cash value begins to accumulate. Over time it grows. The precise growth profile depends on the type of policy, the carrier, the internal cost structure, the crediting method, and the discipline of the funding pattern. I do not need to pretend those details are simple. They are not. This is one reason why I think many people should slow down before touching this tool. Complexity is not evil, but it is not your friend. If you are careless still, if the design is correct and the policy matures, something important becomes available: borrowing power. That is where the bank-like function emerges. You are not withdrawing the value in the ordinary sense. You are borrowing against the cash value. That means the internal value can keep compounding while you simultaneously put loan proceeds to work elsewhere. This duality is what fascinates sophisticated capital allocators. The asset remains in force. The growth engine continues, yet liquidity is accessed and deployed elsewhere. If that outside deployment earns more than the effective cost of the loan over time, the spread belongs to you. Banks do this sort of thing constantly in their own institutional form. They hold assets, borrow against them, lend against them, and earn on the spread. A properly structured policy can let an individual do a much smaller and more personal version of the same logic. That is why I say the product is not magical. It is just leverage with special tax characteristics and internal collateral. Now, I must be honest here. This tool is not for the impatient. It is not for people who may need to surrender early. It is not for households barely holding their budget together who are now being told by some salesman that overfunded life insurance is the master key to everything. That is how disappointment begins. The structure needs time. It needs surplus cash flow. It needs a clear purpose. It needs someone overseeing it who cares more about internal efficiency than about theater. And it needs an owner who understands that borrowing against the policy is not free money. It is a capital move. The spread matters, the use matters, the design matters. If the outside use is foolish, the structure cannot save you from yourself. Still, when built well and used for real capital deployment, it can become a private reservoir. A reservoir matters when the rest of the world needs bank approval. You may have internal collateral. When a real estate opportunity appears and time matters, you may have quicker access. When the tax consequences of liquidating another asset are ugly, you may have another route. That is not a trivial advantage. It is also why wealthy families keep using the structure long after the internet decides it has become unfashionable, because they are not buying a product, they are buying infrastructure. The second tool is more immediately legible to most people and often much more useful for those who are not yet in the class of household that can comfortably fund a large permanent policy with patience. I am talking about borrowing from qualified retirement structures, especially 401k plans and their close relatives when the plan permits it. This is one of those areas where people's minds are damaged by slogans. They have heard "never touch your retirement money" so many times that they stop distinguishing between very different actions. A withdrawal is one thing, a loan is another. Those are not the same event. One may be disastrous, the other may be strategically elegant in the right circumstances. A withdrawal usually destroys tax efficiency immediately. Income tax appears. Penalties may appear, the account shrinks, the compounding base shrinks, the whole event becomes a brute force raid on future security. A properly structured plan loan is different. You are borrowing from a pool that already belongs to you under terms defined by the plan and repaying it with interest that typically goes back into your own account rather than into a bank's profit line. That is an entirely different economic experience. Again, this is not theater, it is mechanics. If you are carrying brutal consumer debt outside the plan, and a permitted plan loan can eliminate that debt at a far lower effective rate, then you are not merely touching retirement. You may be performing internal balance sheet repair if you need short-term bridge liquidity for a serious opportunity or a temporary personal dislocation. And the rules allow a plan loan at reasonable terms. Then the existence of that option is not a curse. It is a valuable flexibility feature. But as always, the tool is not the decision. The use is the decision. That is where adults separate from children. A plan loan used to erase 20+ % revolving consumer debt may be one thing entirely. A plan loan used to fund a lifestyle impulse, a wedding spectacle, a car beyond your means, or some emotional binge disguised as self. Investment is something else. The same loan, different morality, different consequence. I think one reason this tool is so discussed in intelligent ways is that people are nervous about sounding permissive. They want one clean rule because clean rules are easy to broadcast. Never borrow from retirement, fine. It is easy to say. But easy slogans are often expensive where nuance would have made money. There are also risks. Leave an employer before the loan is settled, and some plans can force an uglier acceleration than you expected. Misunderstand your repayment obligations, and the tax outcome can become precisely the mess you were trying to avoid. Treat the plan like a casual ATM, and you will deserve what follows. Still, I cannot ignore the deeper truth. The existence of the loan feature is not an accident. It is recognition that liquidity matters and that there are moments when being able to access your own capital on internal terms is superior to begging external finance to rescue you at a much higher cost. This matters especially for the self-employed who use solo 401k structures or similar plans with broad contribution room. Once again, the pattern repeats. The public sees retirement as a box. Sophisticated users see it as a box with a door and specific rules for using the door without burning the house down. That is a very different mentality. The third tool is the most advanced and, in some ways, the most revealing entity to entity lending. This is where you stop thinking like a borrower and start thinking like a private capital allocator. Most people who own businesses still think about those businesses in ordinary operational terms. Revenue comes in, expenses go out. Maybe profit remains. If money is needed, they go to a bank. That is the default picture. It is not wrong, it is just small. A more sophisticated picture begins by asking a different question: what entities do I already control, and what should each one be for? This is where the architecture really begins. Perhaps one entity owns cash and relatively safe reserves. Perhaps another owns operating risk. Perhaps another holds a property. Perhaps another acts as the vehicle for a specific project with project-specific liability. Once you start thinking this way, capital can move through your own controlled legal structures rather than always through outside lenders. That creates options. Suppose one entity is relatively insulated, lightly exposed, holding capital, and designed to remain as far from operational liability as practical. Another entity is active, taking contracts, doing deals, bearing the daily friction of commercial life. If the safe entity lends to the active one on documented terms with a real note, a real rate, and real repayment behavior, then something interesting has happened. Interest stays in the ecosystem. The operating entity gets capital. The holding entity receives payments, and risk can be compartmentalized more thoughtfully than if everything were blended into one sloppy pool. This is not just about tax. It is about control and insulation. I like insulation not in the emotional sense. In the legal and financial sense, when you lend privately through entities you control, you are not erasing risk. Never believe anyone who says structures erase risk. They do not. But you may be deciding much more carefully where the risk sits and where claims sit if the active layer fails. That is a much more serious way to think. Of course, the tax authorities care whether such arrangements are real, good, they should, related. Party transactions that are fake on paper but absent in behavior deserve to be challenged. That is why documentation matters. A note must exist. Terms must exist. A real market-based or at least defensible rate must exist. Repayment behavior must exist. The transaction must look like what it claims to be. Otherwise, you are not building infrastructure. You are performing costume drama with legal documents. I have no patience for costume drama. Do it properly or do not do it. But if you do it properly, you have started to become something different, not just a business owner, a capital organizer. That is what banks are, after all. Capital organizers who live on spread, collateral, duration, and priority. If you build enough internal architecture, you begin doing a small private version of the same thing for yourself. Now, the source material also touches briefly on two additional sources of internal or semi-internal capital access that are worth mentioning because they reveal the same governing logic: the home equity line of credit and the securities-backed line of credit. I do not think of these as fully being your own bank in the pure sense, because an external institution still stands behind the facility, but they do allow you to borrow against assets you already own rather than against your earnings story alone, and that distinction matters. Borrowing against existing asset value is a different world from ordinary unsecured borrowing. It can be faster, cheaper, less humiliating, more flexible. And it reflects the same deeper truth: assets are not just wealth. Assets can be turned into usable liquidity without always being sold. That is one of the major mental shifts that separates households building actual financial power from households merely collecting balances. A home with equity is not just shelter. A portfolio with size is not just a statement. Under the right circumstances, both can become collateral reservoirs. Now, I would be reckless if I stopped there and let the subject sound cleaner than it is. because every one of these tools can be misused, and misuse is not a small matter here. A poorly designed policy can be an expensive swamp. A plan loan mismanaged can become a tax headache. An entity structure handled sloppily can fail under scrutiny precisely when you most need it to hold. A HELOC can turn your house into collateral for a bad decision. A securities-backed line can become a disaster. If markets fall and the facility is overused, these are not toys, they are tools, and all real tools can cut. That is why I do not want anyone hearing this as encouragement to race off and imitate a structure they only half understand. Half-understood leverage is one of the fastest ways to become a cautionary tale. Still, fear should not make us stupid in the opposite direction. The presence of risk does not mean the tool is bad. It means the user must be disciplined. That is the right adult conclusion. What I want people to take from all this is not some consumer takeaway like buy this policy or set up this account or open that entity next week. I want them to see the larger pattern. Capital should circulate. That is the pattern. The wealthy stay wealthy not only because they earn high returns, but because they design systems in which capital keeps moving through their own channels, producing spread, flexibility, and optionality instead of constantly paying tolls to outsiders. Ordinary people often save, borrow, insure, and invest in totally disconnected compartments. One institution holds the cash. Another extends the credit, another takes the premiums, another gets the investment fees, another gets the interest, another gets the profit on emergency liquidity. The household does all the work while the infrastructure around the household harvests the flows. That is what must change if you want to keep more of the economic value your life produces. You do not have to be rich on day one to start changing it. You only have to think differently. Instead of asking, where do I go when I need money, start asking, what structures am I building now that might let me access my own money more intelligently later? That is the better question. Instead of asking, how do I maximize every visible return number, ask, how do I reduce how often I must pay strangers for access to capital that my own balance sheet could eventually support? That is also a better question. Instead of treating every financial account as a separate island, begin asking whether the islands can be turned into a system. Because systems compound more intelligently than fragments do. That is the final lesson here. Not products, not tricks. Systems. I have always believed the quality of a person's financial life is determined less by income than by understanding. Income helps. Of course, I am not naive, but I have seen too many people with decent income remain financially dependent because they never moved from product thinking to system thinking. And I have seen others, sometimes with less income but much better structure, begin building real private momentum because they understood one simple truth. If you let all your money flow through someone else's architecture, someone else will keep getting rich from your movement. If you build some architecture of your own, even slowly, even imperfectly at first, even in modest ways, then more of the spread can remain with you. That is not ideology. That is arithmetic. And arithmetic applied consistently enough changes lives. So, if you ask me what it really means to be your own bank, I would answer this way. It means building a life where your capital is not merely sitting. It is organized where your assets do not merely exist. They relate where your liquidity does not always require permission, where your interest does not always escape, where your structures are designed with enough patience and enough intelligence that the same dollar can protect, compound, collateralize, and circulate instead of doing only one job once. That is a more powerful way to live financially. Not flashy, not easy, not for everyone at every stage, but very real. And once you see it clearly, the ordinary version of financial life starts looking strangely primitive work. Earn, pay the bank, repeat. There is a better pattern than that. It begins with understanding, then structure, then patience, then scale, and eventually, if you build carefully enough, you stop asking the bank to be the center of your financial universe. You become the center yourself.